Welcome to Lesson 6. In this lesson, we're going to explore how to draw lights and shadows to give things a three-dimensional look. You'll also be able to do your self-portrait, and it's kind of fun to do this and compare it to your pre-instruction drawing where you did your self-portrait. Usually there are lots of changes. All right, this is an exciting lesson. Let's get to it. When you're trying to learn how to draw highlights and reflected lights, shadow shapes, and then cast shadows, it's really helpful to pick a very simple object to practice with. And that's why we pick an egg, because an egg, it has a pleasing shape, and light and shadows do really fun things when you cast a bright light on an egg, and then you can really see the interplay of lights and shadows. So the examples that we have here on the left, the single egg, you can see that the person has drawn the highlights. They've also done a little bit of reflected light up on the bottom of the egg. Not much, just they could have done more actually with that. And they've done some shadows that follow the shape of the egg, and that's what you'll find when you're drawing shadows is they just literally follow the shape, and that makes perfect sense. And then the cast shadow also follows the shape, but it can be very different depending on the light source. The other image that we have here with the three eggs, that's a little different style. It's not quite as subtle, and as a result, it just looks a little rougher and interesting, but it might have been improved by the person taking a little bit more time and not drawing quickly, but really trying to explore the subtleties of the lights and the shadows. I want to show you this grouping of objects in a still life so that you can see the possibilities that arise when you really understand how to use light and shadow to bring objects alive and just make them look three-dimensional, like they're just going to pop right off of the page, or you could reach out and touch them. We see the highlights on the tops of all of these objects, the rounded top that's on the tall white container, and even the rounded shape in the lower part, because it's sticking out, it's catching the light, so it's going to have a highlight on it. And then there's cast shadows from the object that are cast onto the surface of the table or whatever that is. Take a look at the shadows that are around that bulbous part that's in the lower part of that tall white container, and you'll see, as I was saying earlier, the shadow, the shape shadow, follows the shape of that rounded form. And all of these shadows, if you look at every single object, the cup that's on top of the box itself, and the two black objects that are there, they all have that same treatment. So whether they're very light or very dark or somewhere in between, they all have the highlights and the reflected lights that bounce up from the surface, and the shape shadow and the cast shadow. That's a pattern that our eyes and our brains understand, and we interpret that as three-dimensionality. I'm showing you just one example of students' work. There are many examples in the Edwards book so that you can see the students that have done their pre-instruction drawing of their self-portrait, and then they do a more finished portrait after they've had instruction. So I just wanted to point out with this example that you can see that when she did her pre-instruction drawing, the student had a fairly good idea of the shape of the head and the hair and the features. After doing the lesson and using the blank and the measurements to do her self-portrait, it's just looks so much better. The features look real, the proportions look real, and the way the hair is done, she's really spent some time with that, and you can tell that. I think this is a really good example. And even the difference between the two blouses that you see in the pre-instruction drawing, she was just making quick lines, but in the finished self-portrait, she's taking the time to really put down some careful lines. That makes all the difference. Well, I do want to show you a couple of examples of portraits that didn't work out so well, and the students needed to redo them. You'll see the blank that's up in the left-hand corner, and you see there's quite a few details that are part of that blank. And then when you just look below that, the blank, the person hasn't filled that in. They've done just a few. And then you look next to that to see their self-portrait, and you can see that it's kind of shows up there. So however, how you deal with the blank, if you're careful with that and look for those measurements and take the time to mark them into a blank for yourself, it really will pay off. And then the example on the right, same kind of a thing. A person just didn't take the time to fill in the blank, and so they ended up with this drawing that it just doesn't even look anything like a real person. I just want you to see these, that sometimes there are some problems, but with some guidance, the students can go back, they can fill in the blank, and they can try again. As we've done before, let's take a look at some really nicely done examples. And you can see that even with very different faces, hair, ages, there's a common theme throughout these, and that is that the drawing has great sensitivity to the person that's being drawn, and the features are believable, they look like real people, and they're compelling images.